Hi, I'm Alessandra Arcuri, Professor of Law at the Erasmus School of Law and member of the Initiative on Inclusive Prosperity. Today with the initiative we have the honor to interview Tim Bartley. Timothy Bartley is Professor of Sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. And Tim, your work focuses on transnational sustainability and labor standards. This year you have published this extremely insightful book, Rules Without Rights, Land, Labor and Private Authority in the Global Economy with OUP. This book is a powerful blend of sophisticated theories and empirical research. It sheds light on the promises, but mainly the limits of private regulation. We would like to ask you a few questions about your book and your work in general. So now we know that from wood, like this table, and tea, coffee, many products we consume are certified, sustainable, fair trade, and so on and so forth. And the market for these sustainable products are increasing, are growing. Together with the growth in this market, we are witnesses a growth of so-called private regulation. Mm-hmm. Can you explain why this phenomenon is growing so rapidly?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me, and it's great to talk with you about this. I think the fundamental dynamic is about branding and corporate image. And so because so much of companies' value now is based on their brand image and brand reputation, this has become kind of a point of leverage for activists to push companies to do new things. So in response to pressures from activists, demands from socially responsible investors, and sometimes also conscientious consumers, companies are increasingly adopting standards that they apply to their global supply chains. Standards for sustainability, fairness, human rights, and so on. And in some cases this turns into a certification, or companies support a certification like fair trade or the Forest Stewardship Council, which is one of the cases that I look at in my book. And in other cases they're just adopting their own rules for their suppliers. And this is a system of what I call transnational private regulation, because not only are companies adopting these standards, but they're essentially putting themselves in the position of being sort of regulators of their global supply chains. We typically think about regulation as something that governments do, and that's certainly still the case, but companies, especially big brands and retailers in Europe and North America, have increasingly become regulators, for better or worse, of their global supply chains.
So in your book, you are focusing on a concrete case, in particular on the production process of goods like forest products in Indonesia and China. Maybe you will tell us why these two countries. But basically you show that the standards are either poor or poor implemented. And you identify a number of problems. One is certainly that firms search for low price at every level of operation. But there is another problem you identify, which is probably more neglected. And it is that these transnational regulators, which could be companies or the Forest Stewardship Council, tends to imagine these countries as you call empty space, whereas you argue these are crowded space. Can you tell more about this question and why this is possibly a serious problem, and how does this cognitive dissonance between the empty and the crowded space hurt the environment and workers?
Good. So I think one of the things I hope to come out of this book is for both practitioners and researchers to get beyond some of their assumptions about the places where these kinds of global standards are implemented. So I really looked at sort of two kinds of cases of global standards. One is the sustainable forestry case, where the Forest Stewardship Council is the leading multi-stakeholder initiative. And the other cases I focused on is standards for labor conditions, primarily in the apparel and footwear industry, where you have a similar dynamic of brands sort of pushing standards through their global supply chains in order to improve their reputations. When they do that, they often imagine that the place of implementation, which is typically a poor or middle-income country, is sort of something that can be bypassed or transcended. That is, brands and practitioners of corporate social responsibility tend to diagnose those places as so corrupt or incapacitated or incapable of good governance that their job is to basically bypass the state, insert a new set of rules into that setting. And one of the things I argue in the book is that that's ultimately mythical. There's really no bypassing the state, and that domestic governance arrangements really matter, and they actually shape the way in which these kinds of private global standards get implemented on the ground. This empty spaces idea that you mentioned, which I'm glad struck a chord with you, is my way of talking about, in some ways, what's wrong with the scholarship. Much of the research on transnational governance and on corporate social responsibility and sustainability.
For instance, the Forest Stewardship Council, which we know as FSC, and as consumer we think, okay, if there is FSC, we're fine. Why has the problem, or how has the problem of empty space played out in practice?
Yeah, so some of the FSC's principles turn out to be very difficult to implement in particular places. So in Indonesia, for instance, indigenous people living in and around forests often claim rights to those forests, but they're not really granted legal rights to those forests by the Indonesian state. The Forest Stewardship Council, interestingly, has a set of standards that says indigenous people's rights should be respected, and yet they're certifying forests in Indonesia where it's almost impossible for those rights to truly be respected. And so what they do is ultimately arrange for companies or encourage companies to pay somewhat higher compensation to communities living in and around forests. And in some cases that has actually been an improvement on what had been going on before, but it's a far cry from real recognition of those people's rights. This is maybe part of the reason the book is called Rules Without Rights. Yeah. I think the problem is even more severe in the case of labor standards, where companies claim to be supporting freedom of association and the right of workers to join unions in their global supply chains, and yet they're sourcing from factories in China where that's essentially impossible to do, where the right to organize is legally restricted and unions are limited to one officially state-sponsored union. And occasionally that has generated some attempts to work around that and create things like worker committees and internal grievance procedures as a kind of substitute for unions, but I try to argue in the book those are very weak substitutes. The other problem I think that's important to recognize as we move past this assumption that these are empty spaces is that there is law on the books in essentially any country that's exporting products to Europe and the US, even if that law is poorly enforced. And often that law on the books is actually stronger on some issues at least than the international global standards and codes of conduct that brands are promoting. So if one just took Indonesian labor law seriously, for instance, there are strong requirements about not using contingent workers, that workers need to have permanent contracts to be doing kind of the core activity within a factory. And yet, one of the findings in the book is that companies or factories that are governed by a corporate code of conduct are about equally likely as factories that aren't subject to that kind of code to be basically breaking Indonesian law when it comes to the use of contingent workers. So part of what I argue in the book is that if practitioners became more sensitive and more interested in implementing the law that does exist, maybe these kind of global and transnational pressures could help to support stronger enforcement of existing law in the sites of production around the world.
To clarify, what you're saying is that these brands and corporations could work to strengthen existing laws rather than to supplant them.
That's right.
And there's obviously this tension because when you can bring in your own global standard or regulation, you can sort of control the image that projects. But when you're dealing with countries all around the world that have different laws, it's very hard to streamline and package those differences up the supply chain to consumers, I'm guessing.
So I agree, and I wish that that were the big problem, right? Like in some ways that would be an improvement if companies were really thinking about how to comply, how to get their suppliers to comply, which they don't own typically, how to get their suppliers to comply with labor law, laws governing use of land and environmental impacts involved. But for the most part, that's not what they're doing. Non-compliance is widespread, and companies are then trying to kind of clean up the mess by getting their suppliers to make some marginal improvements beyond the norm.
And also maybe in this context, is a problem that they tend to be more process-oriented, management-oriented. So you, even if it's not part of the main case studies, you do refer to the Bangladesh disaster. And there it seems that there was something that was not respected, but was outside of the radar of the auditors. Can you tell us something more about?
Yeah, so I mean, in the when the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh collapsed about 5 years ago, and killed almost 11 or more than 1,100 people, one of many scandals was that the factories in this complex had been audited by brands and by corporate social responsibility initiatives. And so one thing that came to light is that those audits hadn't really paid attention to building safety, which in Bangladesh is a big problem because a lot of the garment industry was built quite quickly in quite unsafe environments. But the other scandal is that it's not like this was invisible. In fact, workers knew that the building was unsafe, and they had been outside the factory because they were afraid that it was an unsafe building, and they were essentially forced to go back in with the threat of losing an entire month's wages. And so we'd like to talk about how corporate social responsibility is empowering workers and giving them voice and so on. But this is a clear case in which even when a hazard was visible, workers didn't have the power and their voices weren't respected enough to actually deal with the problem before we had this huge number of deaths.
So one of the issues that comes up with these sort of disasters is the problem of getting those voices of those who are most marginalized by both institutions and sort of the corporate setup in each country, which, as you stress, is not entirely manageable by central headquarters. And some of the pressures that lead managers to, say, engage in practices that are not sustainable environmentally or in terms of labor practices, do you see those as coming from sort of top-down pressures, or are they sort of embedded in the local culture? Yeah. And then the second question regarding voice is, with indigenous peoples and land access in Indonesia, or in the Bangladeshi workers who had apparently no access point or command chain that they could have their voice heard and say, this is not a safe building for us to go into, and actually have that be heard. What are some of the blocks or hurdles that you identified in your work?
Yeah, so I think for workers' voices or the voices of indigenous people to be heard, they need to be organized, right? And so I think representation is probably more important than voice in many ways. And some of the barriers to organizing are domestic, that is legal restrictions that keep people from organizing collectively. But some of them are rooted in the global supply chain and the dynamics of global industries, which, in spite of the fact that brands and retailers are promoting sustainability and fairness standards, often those same companies are pushing extraordinarily hard for low prices, and for decreasing prices, and for very quick adaptations to changes in production schedules and styles. And this puts tremendous pressure on workers and communities, as well as companies, as well as their suppliers elsewhere in the world. Just to give a concrete example, in Indonesia, workers were organizing and are organizing independent labor unions, something that's not allowed in China, but has burgeoned in Indonesia over the past 15 years. But often those campaigns were undercut because the factories they were organizing in lost orders from the global brands that they had been producing for. In some cases, shut down entirely as orders moved to other cheaper locations within Indonesia and other parts of Asia, of South and Southeast Asia. So another message that I hope comes through in the book is that if one really wants to take corporate social responsibility and corporate sustainability seriously, then that means dealing with prices and the dynamics of orders, not just sending a set of rules and a set of auditors to sort of clean up a mess that's created by really harsh production dynamics. I'd like to find examples of companies that are really taking that seriously, but from what I've seen so far, they're few and far between.
And on this point, you advocate or you argue that a solution, or at least a way to improve the sustainability of global supply chain, is to recenter the state, is to have more legalism. And I would like first to, if you could elaborate more on what this consists on. You give examples, for instance, in the forest production schemes like the EU regulation, the the timber regulation. But then also challenge you a step further, because as a trade lawyer, these days we see debates on modernizing the WTO and whether it would be a good idea to add a chapter on trade and labor, or even have rules on what is called social dumping. So after having elaborated on this idea of recentering the state, could you tell us what is your view on this?
So let me maybe answer by going back in time and then moving forward in time. So in the early 1990s, there was an earlier call for a social clause in the GATT and the WTO that followed, and that was rejected. And the WTO said explicitly that we don't want to deal with labor issues, and that for a variety of reasons, that proposal died. And it's really that moment where you see the explosion of private initiatives and the rise of corporate social responsibility, in many ways to kind of fill the space that international organizations had refused to take. And there's a similar story about the UN and forest governance, where the failure of an intergovernmental agreement actually led to the creation of things like the Forest Stewardship Council. And so really from that point in the mid to late 1990s until very recently, private voluntary regulation has been the main game in town. That is the major way that issues of sustainability and labor rights in the global economy have been dealt with, is through certification, auditing, ethical sourcing policies, and so on. That's beginning to change. And I think there are some signs that the state can be recentered and should be recentered. If we take seriously that the places of implementation are not empty spaces and that there are laws on the books that could actually promote real improvements, then the question for promoters of global responsibility is, how can we support stronger implementation of those laws, stronger enforcement of those laws? So the case that I end the book with, that I'm cautiously optimistic about, is the case of illegal logging, where it turns out that many of the practices that are unsustainable, environmentally damaging, are also illegal, or also against the laws of a country like Indonesia. Not all, but many. And in response to the problem of illegal logging, new regulations emerged both in Europe and the US and in Indonesia that I think have some real potential to change the situation on the ground in ways that voluntary sustainability standards haven't. So in Europe and the US, there are laws that penalize the companies that sell forest products if those products have been made from illegally harvested wood, even if they don't own the companies that illegally harvested the wood. So it creates a kind of accountability dynamic in global supply chains that's very hard to come by, that's almost unheard of. In addition, in places like Indonesia, there are new systems on the ground for verifying the legality of timber operations. And there are NGOs and activist organizations actively monitoring those processes to basically try to keep the definition of legality high instead of letting it get watered down to the lowest possible common denominator. And so the combination of these things, I think, has tremendous potential to allow transnational governance and corporate sustainability initiatives to actually support real reform that might have lasting consequences on the ground in Indonesia and many other timber exporting countries. So the other path that could be taken is the WTO path that you talk about now. So maybe at this moment in which the WTO is sort of in crisis, there could be a new opportunity for a social clause or for some kind of increased respect for labor and environmental standards within the WTO. It looks like the US in many ways is trying to kill the WTO. And it's an odd situation because observers on the left have of course had critiques of the WTO as kind of undemocratic and not really responsive to the needs of marginalized people around the world. But now it's largely conservative governments from the right that are attacking the WTO. My hope would be that maybe there's a moment coming at some point in the not too distant future where more progressive agendas could enter the WTO as a way for the WTO to kind of regain its some legitimacy. Social dumping, in my view, is a terrible term. It's a terrible phrase. And I don't think the arguments about social dumping necessarily capture what I see as the most important problem. So I'm most concerned about the problem of developing countries or poor and middle income countries undercutting each other more than I am about them undercutting conditions in affluent countries. So the competition between Indonesia, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and increasingly a set of countries in sub-Saharan Africa for investment in something like the apparel industry is fierce, and small changes in wages and the power of workers can lead orders to flee to another country. And it's that kind of sort of ultra-competitive undercutting that I think hopefully WTO standards could help to resolve. Part of what the WTO could do would be to endorse some kind of social clause that makes labor and environmental standards part of what we think of as a good investment environment. And part of what they could do, I think, is actually loosen their interpretation of things that they consider to be non-tariff barriers to trade, and give governments a bit more space.
If I can interrupt there, yeah. I think there is also a lot of perceived WTO law, so that I don't think any WTO court has ever interpreted in that way. But indeed, you're right that when you talk with trade diplomats, often this is the perceived WTO law that is presented, yeah. But there is nowhere actually in the text that says so, and nowhere in the interpretation given by courts that it says so. In fact, some scholars say that even with the current text, much more could be done, although there are limits to what the WTO can do without revising text in the sense that now it could block imports, which yeah. is also could be harmful. But there are new also trade chapters in new MIGA regionals, although also those are quite loose when it comes to the enforcement of this provision. Yeah.
So I should say I'm not an expert on WTO law, and so it's great to talk to someone who is. The other thing I would say, though, is that what international organizations primarily do as they adopt labor and environmental standards for trade is work in a kind of government-to-government basis. So if there's a violation, then the government of one country sort of can impose sanctions on the government of another country. I'm getting ahead of myself because I think what's interesting about what's happened around illegal logging is that it's companies at the helm of global supply chains that can actually be penalized. And I think this is really important. I think this takes account of the tremendous power of global production networks and global supply chains around the world. And so I think while some things can happen government to government, I think we should also be thinking about regulations that could better incentivize big brands and retailers to more effectively govern their global supply chains. I think the rise of private regulation and corporate sustainability and human rights practices has shown that companies can do some things when it comes to improving conditions in their supply chains, but they often kind of get away with making pretty small changes and still being seen as leaders in the field of corporate social responsibility. And I think regulations could potentially change that.
Just to follow up with that issue, as we've seen, in the last decade, there's been an increase of corporations that are recognizing that when they're going to the lowest bidder, and if somebody unionizes here, they're going to go over there, and this sort of very temporary contingent relationships they have with different members of their supply chain, that some corporations instead are sort of anchoring with the people in a given location and saying that we are sort of responsible to them, and that you can make all sorts of business arguments for better productivity, less workplace accidents in doing so. But what that allows is some sort of stability for this local organizing or the improvement of conditions without fear that if the price gets marginally too high, that they're going to pull out, which in Indonesia obviously is one of these really sort of existential fears around labor. How could states and intergovernmental actors work to sort of institute this in law rather than having this be the largesse of a few forward-thinking companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for that question. I would agree with the premise that if companies stay put, if they keep their orders in a given location for a longer period of time, that stability should not produce, but at least allow more improvements to occur, at least under the best circumstances. And I think as we understand what makes a responsible company, we should be looking for the companies that are willing to do that. How policy and international organizations could support that, I haven't thought too much about. I think we live in scholars of comparative political economy used to talk about patient capital, that is investment that stays with it for the long haul, even as workers and communities make more demands. And I think if we really want, and right now we live in an era of impatient capital, extremely impatient capital, where quarterly returns are prioritized and companies are constantly seeking the next sourcing location that can produce the same quality at a lower price. I think if citizens, policymakers, and companies started thinking about how to build a world with at least some degree of patient capital, patient investment, or patient sourcing, then much more could be accomplished through both private and public action. I am trying to make this comparison between labor standards in one case and land and environmental standards in the other case. And I think this is really important in order for us to understand how private regulation and corporate accountability work across different issues. But it's sort of rare. I mean, I think both in terms of practitioners and in terms of scholars, there's still a lot of siloing between people that are concerned mainly with labor and human rights and people that are concerned mainly with environmental management. And so another thing I hope the book does is kind of increase the conversation between those different worlds.
So, well, thank you very much. That's very insightful. I think everybody, and not just academics, but practitioners, both in the private field, but also in the public, as public regulators, can learn a lot from your book. That is really about the big picture, but also about those details that might lead to more nuanced solution to the daunting problems we face today. And as initiative, we are very grateful because I think your work really shed great light on this interrelation of private and public regulation and how this can, even if to a modest extent, help us to achieve a goal of inclusive prosperity. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.